The envelope was sitting on the dining room table when my parents arrived home from my brother's wedding reception. Plain white, no return address, just my grandfather's handwriting on the front. Careful, deliberate, the kind of handwriting that belongs to a man who understood that words, once written, cannot be taken back. My mother saw it first. She picked it up the way you pick up something you're not sure is safe to touch. My father stood beside her, still in his wedding suit, his boutonniere slightly wilted from the long day. They had just spent 8 hours celebrating my brother Thomas's wedding, a wedding that had been planned for 14 months, a wedding with 240 guests, a 12-piece band, a venue that cost more than most people's annual salary, a wedding to which my grandfather, their father, had not been invited. Not because he was ill, not because he couldn't travel, not because there was any practical reason that made sense, because Thomas had decided he didn't want him there, and my parents, who had spent 40 years learning to give Thomas exactly what he wanted, had agreed. My grandfather had found out 3 weeks before the wedding. He had said nothing to anyone. He had simply sat with it the way he had always sat with difficult things, quietly, privately, and with more intention than anyone around him realized. The envelope had been delivered that morning. My parents hadn't noticed it when they left for the ceremony. My mother opened it, standing in the hallway. She read the first page. Then she sat down on the floor, right there, in her formal dress, and she didn't get up for a very long time. What was in that envelope changed our family forever. My name is Lily, and in my family, I was the one who noticed things. Not the one who was celebrated for noticing, not the one whose observations were welcomed or discussed, just the one who sat quietly at the edge of family gatherings, watching the dynamics that everyone else participated in too deeply to see clearly. My brother Thomas was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment he arrived, he occupied a different category in our family's universe. He was louder, more demanding, more certain of his own importance, and my parents, for reasons I spent years trying to understand, found that quality irresistible. They moved toward him the way plants move toward light, constant, instinctive, without apparent choice. I remember being 14, receiving a merit scholarship for my school, the first one awarded in 3 years. I came home with the letter, which was printed on heavy cream paper with a gold seal at the top. My mother looked at it, nodded, and said, "That's wonderful, Lily. Thomas has a football match on Saturday. Do you want to come?" The letter sat on the kitchen counter for a week. Then it disappeared. I never saw it again. My grandfather, William, was different. He was my father's father, a quiet man who had built a successful commercial property business over 40 years, and then, when he retired, had retreated into a life of books, long walks, and conversations that actually went somewhere. He was the only person in my family who asked follow-up questions, the only one who remembered, months later, the things I had told him in passing. When I was struggling through my first year at university, he drove 4 hours to take me to dinner and listen. He didn't offer solutions, he didn't redirect the conversation, he just listened. And then he said, "You're going to be fine, Lily, not because things will get easier, because you're the kind of person who pays attention." I held that sentence for years, but I was about to find out how much he had been paying attention to. The decision not to invite my grandfather to Thomas's wedding had not been made quickly. It had been discussed, negotiated, and ultimately decided over several months, and I had been kept outside of every conversation. Thomas's reasoning, as it was eventually relayed to me through my mother, was simple. My grandfather was, in Thomas's words, difficult. He asked uncomfortable questions. He expressed opinions that Thomas found inconvenient. At a family dinner 2 years earlier, my grandfather had gently suggested that Thomas's treatment of his then-fiancée Rebecca seemed dismissive. Thomas had not forgotten that. So Thomas decided, and my parents, who had spent 4 decades being unable to deny Thomas anything, agreed. When I found out, 6 weeks before the wedding, I called my mother. "Grandpa isn't invited?" Thomas feels it's for the best, she said. You know how your grandfather can be. He's 81 years old, I said. He's Dad's father. It's Thomas's wedding, Lily. It's his day. I sat with that conversation for a long time. I called my grandfather that evening. He answered on the second ring, as he always did. I didn't know how to begin, so I just said, Grandpa, I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Don't be sorry, my love. Everything happens exactly as it should. I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was being gracious. I thought he was protecting me from his own pain. He was doing something else entirely. The wedding day came. I attended, I smiled at the appropriate moments, danced when the music required it, and sat at a table far enough from my parents that I didn't have to perform a happiness I didn't feel. Thomas and Rebecca looked beautiful. The venue was stunning. Everything was exactly as Thomas had wanted. And my grandfather sat at home alone with his books and his quiet and whatever he had already decided to do about it. I didn't know then that 3 weeks before the wedding, he had visited his solicitor. I didn't know that he had spent those 3 weeks making very careful decisions about a document he had been meaning to update for years. I only found out when my parents called me 3 days after the wedding, their voices doing something I had never heard from either of them before. My mother called at 7:30 in the morning. I was still in bed. She never called that early. Lily? Her voice was strange, flat and strange. You need to come home. What happened? Is Grandpa? He's fine. Just come. I drove 2 hours. My parents were sitting at the kitchen table when I arrived, still in the clothes they had worn to a family dinner the night before, which told me they hadn't slept. Between them, spread across the kitchen table, were several pages of a document I recognized immediately as a legal letter. My father's eyes were red. My mother's hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. What is this? I asked. Sit down, my father said. I sat. He pushed the pages toward me. It was a letter from my grandfather's solicitor, hand-delivered to their address that morning as per my grandfather's specific instruction. Inside was a formal summary of changes made to my grandfather's will 3 weeks prior. I read it slowly. My grandfather's estate was substantial. Over 40 years of commercial property investment, carefully managed, had produced a net worth that his solicitor summarized at approximately £4.2 million. The previous will had divided the estate equally between my father and his sister Margaret. The revised will was different. My father's share had been adjusted, not removed, adjusted. Specifically, the portion of the estate that my father would have received had been reduced by the value equivalent to what my grandfather calculated as the cost of his exclusion from his grandson's wedding, not financially, but symbolically. That portion, described in the letter as a reflection of the value placed on family by those who will inherit it, had been redirected. To me. I looked up from the pages. My mother was staring at the table. My father had his hand over his mouth. And at the very bottom of the letter, in a separate handwritten note that the solicitor had been instructed to include, my grandfather had written 6 words in his careful, deliberate handwriting. She was always paying attention. I couldn't breathe. He had seen everything. Every dinner, every displaced certificate, every moment I had sat at the edges and watched and said nothing. And he had been watching back. Thomas arrived 2 hours later. My mother had called him. I don't know what she said, but he drove fast. And when he walked into the kitchen, his expression was the specific, tight blankness of someone who has been told something they are not yet willing to believe. He read the letter standing up. His eyes moved across the pages twice. Then he set it down. "This is because of the wedding," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," my father said quietly. "He's punishing me." I looked at Thomas. I had been quiet in that kitchen for 2 hours, sitting with everything the letter contained, sitting with my grandfather's 6 words at the bottom of the page, sitting with 40 years of being the one who noticed and said nothing. I decided I was finished being quiet. "He's not punishing you," I said. "He's telling the truth, in the only language that was going to be heard." Thomas looked at me. "You don't understand what Grandpa is like." "I understand exactly what he's like," I said. "He asks uncomfortable questions. He says things people find inconvenient. He remembered every birthday, every graduation, every difficult thing any of us went through, and he showed up. Every single time." Thomas was silent. "You excluded an 81-year-old man from your wedding because he once suggested you were being unkind to your fiancé," I said. "And he was right, and you knew he was right, and that's why you didn't want him there." My mother made a sound. Protest or pain? I couldn't tell. "I'm not angry at you," I said, and I meant it. "I'm just done pretending I don't see what I see." Thomas left without saying much more. My father sat at the table for a long time afterward, not speaking. At some point, he reached across and took my hand, just for a moment. Then he let go. It wasn't an apology, but it was the most honest thing he had done in years. My grandfather is still alive. He is 81 years old, in reasonable health, and entirely aware of exactly what he set in motion. I visited him 2 weeks after the letter arrived. We sat in his garden with tea he made himself, too strong, the way he always made it, and he didn't mention the will directly. He asked about my work. He asked about a book I had recommended to him 3 months earlier. He asked if I was sleeping properly. Eventually, I said, "You didn't have to do that, Grandpa." He looked at me with those steady eyes of his. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." Thomas is furious. "Thomas," he said calmly, "will learn something from this, or he won't. Either way, I've said what needed to be said." I have not changed my relationship with Thomas. That is a longer and more complicated process, and I am not in a hurry. My parents and I have had 2 honest conversations, the first in my memory, about the dynamics that shaped all of us. What I have, my grandfather's 6 words at the bottom of that letter, the knowledge that someone saw me clearly and loved me honestly, the particular piece of being known, no amount of estate adjustment can manufacture that. It was given, freely, by the only person in my family who understood that paying attention is its own form of love. Some forms of love are quiet. They don't announce themselves at dinner tables or perform for audiences. They show up for 4-hour drives. They ask follow-up questions. They sit with you in the difficult moments and say, "You're going to be fine," because you pay attention. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they leave behind something that says, more clearly than any speech ever could, exactly who they saw. If you have ever been the one watching from the edges, the one who noticed everything and said nothing, this story was for you. Drop a heart if you believe that being seen is its own kind of inheritance. Comment below, has anyone in your family ever surprised you with how much they were paying attention? Tell me, I read every single one. Subscribe, because every week we tell the stories of women who were overlooked, underestimated, and quietly witnessed by the one person who mattered most. And every week we show what happened when that witness finally spoke. Because the quietest love leaves the loudest proof.